Hello, my name is Lea Ellwardt and I'm assistant professor at the University of Cologne, and in this talk I would like to talk about two things. First, an empirical study on social network characteristics and stress in late adulthood, and after that I would like to talk about an empirical data collection on egocentric networks that has just been completed. The motivation for this research is that we all know that integration into social relationships is very beneficial for health. So well-integrated people suffer less often from depression, dementia, cancer, cardiovascular diseases, and they also tend to live longer than socially isolated people. And the effect size is far from trivial, as the effect of being socially isolated compares quite well to the effect of being a long-term smoker. And explanations for this are commonly the main model, which states that there's a direct positive effect of social integration on health through physiological and biological pathways. Here the focus is mainly on structural characteristics in the network, such as how many people are in the network, so how large is the network, but also how diverse is the network in terms of social relationships. The buffer model assumes that networks buffer the adverse effects of stresses for health. And stresses can be chronic, but it can also be traumata or critical life events. And here the assumption is that the social support and behavior that comes through social networks are beneficial for health and are able to moderate the potentially negative effects of stresses. Here the emphasis is more on the functional aspects of networks. So we can basically characterize the beneficial effects of social networks through function and structure. So function is all about the quality of social relationships and how far they offer help and assistance for individuals, whereas structure is really about quantifying the relationships, the diversity therein, but also seeing in how far people within the network are actually connected to one another. And in aging research, network theorizing has mostly coexisted to theories on aging, which I perceive problematic as such, as the focus is mostly on the function of social relationships, and many studies are not emphasizing enough on the structural aspects of social networks, which is also because there's quite a substantial lack of suitable data to test that. So mostly these data are approximated. We only know about a person's direct relationships with people in the networks, but we know little about the relationships between these people in the network. And of course, in real life networks, these relationships also exist. And we know from meta-analysis, but also more theoretical work, that it is useful to include both functional and structural aspects in the analysis of social networks if we really want to understand how they are positively related to health. So we should use complex measures to really capture real-life social networks. And this has not been done yet a lot, also because we lack suitable data in many cases. Therefore, social gerontology has mostly focused on the direct relationships between a focal person ego and her contacts alters. So here, for example, we have one person connected to 6 alters, and you could say more relationships is better because you potentially receive more social support from your network. However, also these alters may be connected among themselves or may not be connected. And my problem is that if we exclude this view, we are too easily jumping to conclusions such as that more relationships are always better, and such as that resources flow easily, and that also positive relationships are always beneficial. But this might not necessarily be the case, as I would like to show. In this exemplary study, my co-authors and I were interested in how far we can relate closure and balance in networks to perceived stress in an older population. And we hypothesized, based on the closure argument, that individuals in social relationships expect to receive something back at some point, so social exchange theory would assume so, and the better people are connected, also the more mutual connections they have, the more easily such exchange should happen. Basically because you're belonging to a certain community, and the sense of solidarity velocity is higher. We know this from research and cooperation. So even though you may not be able to directly pay back favors, since you're part of the community, you're expected to contribute something to someone at some point. So based on this theory, we could expect that individuals who are embedded in many closed triads, so triangles where ego is related to two alters who are also related to one another, that resources flow much better and hence the perceived stress of this individual is also lower. So more closed triads should relate to lower perceived stress. Another hypothesis is on balance. Balance theory assumes that individuals have a strong preference for their social context to be balanced out. So if I have two friends, I like them to be friends too and not to be enemies with one another. Because if that happens, I will be stressed, or more likely to be stressed, because I might be expected to take sides. But I'm also receiving negative feedback perhaps from one friend about another friend, and this is something that puts me at unease, and it's just something I don't usually prefer to hear and to do. So based on this idea, we hypothesize that the more balanced triads an individual has in her personal network, the less stressed this individual is. So here, balanced triad is characterized by 3 positive ties. There are also other balanced states, but we focus on the simple case here. The more people are going along with each other in the network, the better. And just to illustrate this point a little bit more, in a classical view on networks, we would assume a larger network is more functional. So this is also basically what we would assume from aging research on aging. So this network here on the left-hand side is much larger than the one on the right-hand side. We assume the left network is much more supportive and better for an individual than the right network. If we now consider what's the relationship quality between alters, we may find that there are conflicts in networks. So note that in both networks, ego only has positive relationships. However, in the left network, the alters have negative relationships among each other. This means that ego might be drawn into third-party conflicts. We know this from family research that a lot of the time dyadic conflicts take on a more collective level. So imagine I have a very good relationship with my mother and I have a very good relationship with my brother, but I am also in a problematic situation once my mother and my brother start fighting, because I may not be able to invite both of them for Christmas and I will have to choose, and then I get into trouble with the other one. So it's quite easy to imagine such a situation. So, and if we would now include the quality of the interrelations in our network view, we would come to the conclusion that the traditional view doesn't hold. So it might be better to have a smaller network where everyone likes everyone, and that could be eventually the much more functional network if you focus on function rather than structure in this case, for example. And to test our expectations, we use the Chicago Health, Aging and Social Relations study. It covers 5 waves, and networks were measured every wave. And this is a very unique data set collected by John Cacioppo, where people were not only asked to report on their direct relationships with alters, but they were also asked how they perceived the relationships between the contacts in their network. So alter-alter ties were measured, and we have 160 individuals who took part in this module. And the dependent variable in our model is perceived stress. That's a validated scale from the stress literature, and people were asked to rate on a Likert scale in how far they felt stressed at times, whether they were nervous, whether they had the impression that they were in charge of things, or whether they still had control over things that happened in their life. The independent variables were the number of closed triads and the number of balanced triads. So closed triads with only strong ties and balanced triads with only positive ties. And these could be basically generated from the network module, which used a name generator. So people generated their direct contacts. And then in the second step, they would also indicate how often contacts met each other and whether they had a liking or disliking relationship. As confounders, we included the usual socio-demographic suspects, but also variables like loneliness and network size, so the number of alters in the network. And this is basically the chart an interviewer used. It was face-to-face interviews and was an Excel sheet where, after having generated all the alter names, the interviewer would go through this chart per alter-alter pair and fill in the values for the frequency and the quality of the relationship. Since they were assumed to be symmetric or reciprocal, the interviewer only had to fill in half of this matrix. So that's quite burdensome. Up to 10 alters could be nominated. And yeah, you can imagine that this is quite a lot of work to do, and also asked a lot of motivation from respondents. And based on the information on the ego alter ties and the alter-alter ties, we could now constitute all the different possible triangles based on the strength and the positivity of a relationship. And in our hypothesis, we are mainly interested in the closed triangle with 3 strong relationships and the balanced triad with 3 positive relationships. Some of these constellations are empirically very improbable. For example, we hardly observe triangles with only weak or only negative relationships. And to see in how far these network characteristics, closure and balance, related to perceived stress, we ran mainly fixed effects models. The advantage of such a model is that you compare a person with herself over time. So you see in how far stress levels changed in one person depending on the same person's number of balanced triads in the network. So we're not comparing between people, but within the same person over time. And then the main advantage of this is that we do not have to worry then about individual characteristics that are assumed constant over time, such as education, gender, but also personality traits like neuroticism. However, for robustness checks, we still checked with random effects models that checked for differences between people. If you now look at the main effect of only all the triangles, we see that in terms of closure and openness, we do not see any significant relationship with perceived stress. Also, imbalance does not relate to perceived stress, and you also see these very large confidence intervals down here, which is due to the fact that these triangles were hardly observed in the data set. What we do see for the positively balanced triangles with 3 positive relationships, that there's a very small yet significant relationship with perceived stress. And if we now look at the full models, we see that this picture is basically confirmed. So closure remained unrelated to perceived stress, whereas balance, in terms of having 3 positive ties in a triangle, was related to a lower stress level. And to just illustrate this more, if we would divide the population of the sample into 2 and say we have the stressed and the not stressed group, in order to be in the not stressed group, you would have to have 7 people in your network who are mostly positively connected. So let's say you have 3 family members, 2 neighbors, a friend and a colleague. You would have 7 people in your network who all know each other and have a good relationship among each other. This already would facilitate that you're belonging to the less stressed group. So empirically quite possible to achieve this effect. And the robustness analysis revealed no different conclusions. So no matter how we torture the data, this balance effect would always remain. Also checked with random effects models, we would still come to the same picture. And we could also not find any indication for reverse causation. So this seems to be a rather stable result. And based on this, we learn that it seems like that balance in networks reduces stress, and this is independent of any of the confounding variables, which included also network size and relationship strength. We did not find a negative effect of imbalance, perhaps because there was just so few imbalanced triads in the data set. But also it could be that if 2 family members fight, that ego in some ways might benefit from that, as in you have 2 allies who are much more focused on you and see an ally in you. Closure did not matter as much as we expected, perhaps because openness also has its value. We know from Granovetter's work that weak ties can be important as they open the door to alternative resources that are not yet available in strong ties, perhaps. So based on this study, I would like to conclude that it is important and does make sense to look at the interconnections in an ego network. So we should not only focus on the relationship between ego and alter, but we should also look at the structural and functional aspects of the alter-alter relationships. And based on this study, I was thinking, well, what to do next? And since the previous data set was also very specific in terms of population, but also rather small, I thought it would be really nice to replicate this in a larger sample and a more representative sample, perhaps. So we as in my colleague Theo van Tilburg at the University in Amsterdam and I, decided to carry out a similar data collection in the Netherlands. And just to show what aging research has to offer right now in terms of egocentric data, here's some example data sets. We have, for example, the German and the Dutch aging studies that use name generators and face-to-face interviews to assess the relationships of egos and alters. However, in many of these aging surveys, there's a limit, as in how many alters you may generate, and only one, namely the NCHAP, is really looking at in how far also the alters have relationships among each other. However, this, as far as I know, is constrained to just contact frequency. And while this is very valuable and great data, as network researchers, we are not yet able to test some really complex structures. So usually are down to testing network size and network diversity, and it is hard to really go deeper. And would be great to also know more about the alter-alter relationships. So that's why Theo and I decided to plan an add-on study within the Longitudinal Aging Study Amsterdam. This is a perfect starting point because this has existed already since the early 90s. Every 3 years they collect a very comprehensive network module without any limitations on the number of alter. And of course all sorts of relevant health modules. And as part of the main interview, this network module has been in there already since the early 90s. So it's a very nice longitudinal data set. And what is great about this study is that participants are usually quite committed to participating in this research. Some of them have been a part of this for more than 20 years and they're really happy to regularly participate. On the other hand, I was also told that they sometimes find it a bit boring to answer the same questions over and over again, so that it is quite common for this Longitudinal Aging Study Amsterdam to sometimes offer some modules in between waves to collect some additional data, but also to keep the participants happy and interested. So then they sometimes put in some experimental stuff or some modules that they only measure cross-sectionally. And the last time we basically decided to add something on the networks part. So the participants who agreed to also participate in this add-on study received an additional questionnaire 1 month after they had completed the main interview. So first in the main interview they had the very normal standard network module where they generated their alters, and they were also asked about the relationships with these alters, and then they were asked whether they would be okay to participate in some more research on this in a written questionnaire, and those who said yes received this extra questionnaire which would only ask about these relationships between the alters. So this was not yet covered in the main interview, so it was this two-step procedure, the first one in the main interview face-to-face, the second one as an add-on in a written survey about 1 month after the main interview, so that we wouldn't have to be worried that the network had changed too much already. And to not surprise respondents too much, with our research design, we already announced in advance we will be asking you about the people you just generated in this main interview. And it will be only a maximum of 5 people we have some follow-up questions for. So is this okay with you? And most people agreed to that, so that we could send out more than 1,300 questionnaires. And reasons for not participating or not sending out a questionnaire was mainly that people had broken up the interview or terminated it before completing the network module, or that they had not generated a minimum of 2 alters, because in order to ask about the relationships between 2 alters, we needed at least 2 alters that were generated in this main interview. Now, main challenge in this survey design is that we are dealing with an older population who has to be able to understand and fill in this questionnaire by themselves. So what we did is that we presented them with the list of the alters they had generated. So we gave them a list of questions where we already put in the names of the people they had generated in the main interview. So for example, person A and B, and then again for person A and person C, and so on. And because we limited this to a maximum of 5 alters per question module, this would be a maximum of 10 items. So a lot of work, but still doable, also considering that people could fill in these surveys by themselves at home and also take breaks. To avoid that people got confused because perhaps they had the same name twice in the network. For example, Jan is a very popular and common name in the Netherlands. In the cover sheet, they were presented with all the names and including the relationship type. So would, for example, say your neighbor Jan or your cousin Jan, so that they really knew to whom this referred. And because we're already able to collect this additional data, we also decided to ask some more questions on the ego-alter relationship. So what was missing in the main interview was information on in how far there were conflicts between ego and alter, and also what was the mode of contact. Was it mainly face-to-face contact, or did people mainly have contact through digital means like WhatsApp, texting, or phone calls? So some extra questions included. And this data collection has just been completed, so unfortunately I cannot yet present results. However, I would already like to share some thoughts about what I think are the opportunities and constraints of such a design. In my view, this is one way of trying to retrieve additional data on the alter-alter ties, also within large-scale surveys. So you can implement it in any size of a survey, in any sampling design, and you can also do this longitudinally. What is nice for respondents, they can do it at home in their own time by themselves. And of course, through collecting such data, this opens a door to being able to test a lot of more hypotheses that you're not able to test through the standard network modules. However, there's also a downside to this design. For example, we limited the number of alters or the number of follow-up questions simply because it would have been too many questions. So it's a written survey that people do by themselves, and you cannot send like 100 pages to people and expect them to fill this in. And that also relates to the next point, that the change of data collection mode, of course, might also mean that there was less motivation to fill in these questionnaires rather than when you're sitting together with an interviewer. So people may have jumped to the next question more quickly. And another problem, as we know, that will be the case for most egocentric network research, is that ego was just an informant and the relationships between his or her alter. So it is about the perceived relationship from the viewpoint of ego. It is myopic and it might not be accurate at all. And this limits the extent to which kind of research questions we can test. If it's, for example, about perceived stress, as in the previously presented example, I do not perceive this as very problematic, because balance theory, for example, is also assuming that this is a perception of a person, and the perception is what matters for being stressed or not stressed. However, if you're interested in other types of variables concerning health, informant accuracy might be really important. So essentially, this kind of research design measures cognitive social networks and not real social networks. We have, in fact, not talked to alters, and we simply don't know what the real relationships look like. However, this is one way of doing it, and it is suitable for many research questions, but it should just be kept in mind. I'm very happy that I was able to share my research and also my current research plans with you, and I'm very curious about your feedback and questions. Thank you very much.